Something significant is unfolding in Iran right now. Not just another protest wave, not just another moment of anger followed by repression and silence, but something that feels different. Because Iran has been here before. Again and again, we've seen cycles of unrest, moments of courage, moments of crackdowns, and then quiet. Each time the question is the same. Does this break the pattern or does it fade into another lull? But this time, the real question isn't just that Iranians are protesting again. It's whether the conditions surrounding these protests have fundamentally changed and what that would mean far beyond Iran's borders. And that matters because as we enter 2026, we are already drowning in geopolitical crisis, from Latin America to Eastern Europe, from the Arctic to the Middle East. Everything seems to be happening at once. But when events pile up this quickly, the real danger isn't missing information, it's missing structure. It's failing to see what is a symptom, what is a cause, and what may be quietly connected. So in this analysis, I want to do three things. First, I'll explain what is actually happening inside Iran. Second, I'll show you why this wave of protests is different from what we've seen before. And third, I'll explain why what's happening in Iran matters strategically also for Europe. And then we'll go one step further, because we also need to talk about the options, the risks and the illusions surrounding regime change and why that might be the most misunderstood part of this entire moment. So stick around because this could really matter. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And if you are new here, this channel focuses on geopolitics and strategy. It looks at the global constellation of actors, systemic transformations, and the effect of geopolitical tensions on security and the economy. Consider subscribing if that's your thing. Before we start, I have one question for you to think about during the video. Do you think the current protests are any different this time from past protests in Iran? Did you pick up some insights from X or other sources, for example? Let me know in the comments, and I'm also happy to discuss it there with you. So let's jump straight to the heart of what triggered the latest events in Iran and what's next. Javid Shah, long live the Shah. I have seen this message countless times on my timeline on X over the past few days. In response to the protests in Iran, the Shah's son has also announced that he is making preparations to return to Iran. Are we seeing a reversal of the events of 1979? I think it is too early to say, and it is also important to understand that the monarchists have a good propaganda machine at their disposal. But it is clear that the protests in Iran go beyond criticism of the consequences of the economic crisis in Iran. They are now openly calling for the overthrow of the current regime and thus an end to the repressive Islamic rule in Iran. The situation is currently unclear. On January 8, the leadership in Tehran shut down global internet access for the population. But yeah, we can say, but thanks to Elon Musk's Starlink, information is still getting out. There are protests throughout the country, that's what we know, as is clearly shown on this map here. And the regime is suppressing the protests, resulting in countless deaths. US President Donald Trump has warned the Iranian leadership that the US will, in his words, crack down hard if protesters are killed. And also Marco Rubio wrote on X, the United States supports the brave people of Iran, end of quote. According to Reuters, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio discussed specific options for US intervention in Iran in a telephone conversation on Saturday. This too could fuel the demonstrations in Iran. The Associated Press has verified footage of protesters marching through Tehran and chanting slogans that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Examples are The country won't be a real homeland until the clerics are gone. End of quote. The language used is so different to that used in past protests. I will talk more about this later. I think it's clearly calling for regime change. The regime is also responding in a way as it seems, as it understands this. And there seem to already be plans in place to fly regime representatives out of the country to Moscow. The events in Iran matter to Europe as well. Iran has been a challenge to European security for years. So let's go back to 2015. Relations between Europe and Iran reached a peak, we can say, with the conclusion of the nuclear agreement, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This agreement reached between Iran, the US, Russia, China, and the E3. The E3 are 3 European countries, France, Germany, and the UK. And this agreement was part of Europe's attempt to limit security risks by reaching a binding agreement with Iran. From Iran's perspective, the agreement meant accepting restrictions on its nuclear program in exchange for the gradual lifting of sanctions. The agreement aimed to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region, and the framework also made talks on Iran's missile program and regional power protection possible. But after the US left the agreement in 2018 and reinstated sanctions against Iran, and the conflict between Iran and Israel erupted, the agreement has effectively been suspended. And in October 2025, so last year, the regime in Iran said that it was no longer bound by the 2015 agreement. And at the same time, we can say that the Iran-Europe relationship has undergone a structural shift. The Islamic Republic no longer views Europe primarily as a potential cooperation partner, but increasingly as a part of an opposing geopolitical camp. The political distancing has been made worse by a number of factors. These include the suspension of the nuclear agreement, as I just mentioned, then Iran's support for non-state actors in the Middle East, and differing views on the Gaza war and Israel's regional security situation as well. And here we must ask a question relevant to Europe. Why is Iran not only a regional actor, but also a strategic factor from a European perspective? One key reason for this lies in the indirect but systemic influence that Iranian foreign and security policy has had on European security for years. So we have to know the Iranian regime affects European security in several ways. First, Iran plays a role in the war in Ukraine. It has done so by supplying the Russian Federation with its Shahed drones and circumventing Western sanctions. In early 2023, Iran reached a 1.75 billion deal with Russia to produce these drones. Second, the role of digital infrastructure as a geopolitical lever. The information space can be used strategically. Europe is doing so, and so is the Iranian regime. Western intelligence services, including the US services, have pointed out that Iran is using social media to influence political discourse in Western democracies. This is relevant for Europe because open societies are vulnerable to external influence. The challenge lies in their limited detectability and traceability. And then third reason is Iran is increasingly involved in a non-Western vision of international order. Its membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, its invitation to join the BRICS, now called the BRICS Plus, its strategic cooperation with Russia, and its rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, brokered by China. All these elements I just listed, in my view, show that Tehran is realigning its foreign policy positioning for the long term. For Europe, this means that Iran is no longer balancing between different centers of powers, but sees itself more as a part of an alternative order project. Now, with the protests and the possible power struggles in the run-up to a potential leadership succession, increased repression and potential unrest in Peripheral regions such as Kurdistan and Balochistan could have negative spillover effects as well. But risk analysis alone is not enough. How Europe responds is an important variable in all of this. The Iranian regime has been working against the interests of European countries and the US, as we have seen. The current protests, therefore, present a geostrategic opportunity for Europe, I think. The EU has already taken a clear diplomatic position, condemning the regime's use, for example, of violence to suppress the protests. And this is in the interest of Europeans, as it positions the bloc, the EU, the European states, on the side of the protesters' cause. At the same time, options to tighten sanctions against Iran can be considered, particularly to prevent their bypassing in order to build on the current momentum and increase pressure on the Iranian regime. Europeans should also give their American partners their full support. The US president has said that the US would intervene if Iran kills peaceful demonstrators. Quoting him here, "We are ready and can start immediately," end of quote. And Marco Rubio is, as we have already seen, in contact with Israeli president for a possible intervention. The US demonstrated its preparedness to carry out targeted strikes in Iran with Operation Warhammer last year. This is therefore certainly a strategic option. And note that this is not about regime change from the outside, but rather about change coming from within Iran, carried out by countrywide protests. This momentum we have right now in Iran should therefore be exploited to the fullest extent possible to enable a largely peaceful change of government. But of course, not every response leads to greater stability. We also need to have this in mind. The options available can always have unintended consequences, so every move in the coming weeks needs to be carefully considered. Political unrest in authoritarian regimes rarely follows a linear or predictable path. Historical examples from Iran in 1979 to the Arab Spring in Libya and Syria show that large-scale protest movements not necessarily lead to stable political transitions. Often they have resulted in power vacuums and prolonged instability. For European decision makers, therefore, the decisive factor is to understand which scenarios are realistic and which pose the greatest risk. A robust analysis must reflect this range of possible developments, I think. Rather than assuming a favorable outcome. One plausible scenario is that the protests will fail and the status quo will be maintained. This pattern is familiar from Iran's past. Although the Islamic regime has never been fully legitimized by society, it has not yet been possible to overthrow it successfully. Since 1979, there have been repeated mass mobilization that have failed to effect structural change. The Green Movement in 2009, following the controversial presidential elections, then protests in response to economic upheaval in 2017-18, nationwide unrest with a strong socio-economic character in 2019. Then we had mobilization following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, and the current wave of protests. Iran expert Roya Hakakian points out that the current mobilization differs from previous phases in several respects. First, parts of the regime's traditional social support base are also participating for the first time, including bazaar merchants and conservative middle-class groups. Second, according to her, the movement has broader social, ethnic and generational penetration. And third, demands have shifted from reformist approaches to an explicit rejection of the system. And then fourth, the regime's promise of security has been undermined by recent military setbacks. And the last point is external signals, especially from the US, have apparently changed the protesters' perception of risk. Let me put this in other words. I think it remains to be seen whether these factors are sufficient to alter the balance of power in Iran. And for Europe, this means consistently weighing up the costs and benefits of potential courses of action. Any form of external influence has intended and unintended consequences. For example, a stronger political stance could signal unity across the Atlantic to Washington, but it could also reduce Europe's ability later in the year to mediate in the future. The guiding question for Europe is which decisions will most reliably secure its long-term security. And in light of the current risks posed by the Iranian regime, the best outcome for the Iranian people and in the also geostrategic interests of the Europeans would be a new and democratic government in Iran. Another aspect that makes the Iranian crisis relevant for Europe is its direct impact on international energy and commodity markets. Market observers have reported a rise in oil prices of several percentage to political unrest in Iran and general uncertainty regarding the supply situation, which can be attributed to Tehran's role as a major oil exporter. With daily production exceeding 3 million barrels and export volumes of over 2 million barrels per day, Iran is a critical supplier of global energy needs, with volume significantly, for example, exceeding those of Venezuela. This is also a thing that matters. And this increases volatility in a market already burdened by structural supply and demand dynamics, and means that security of supply price risks and associated hedging strategies must become central to the risk analysis of European companies. And then there is also the Strait of Hormuz. It remains a vulnerable transit corridor for a significant proportion of global oil shipments, which could trigger further price fluctuations and supply disruptions if political instability in Iran remains high. In this context, robust planning and hedging against external shocks are important. But from a European perspective, it would be short-sighted to view current developments exclusively as a risk factor. An orderly political transition in Iran, a hypothetical right now, but provided it does not lead to prolonged instability or fragmentation, could have stabilizing effects in the long term. This could include a reduction in regional tensions, less military confrontation, partial reintegration into international economic structures, and the realignment, again, of Iranian and European foreign policy. The key point to note is that such developments are neither predictable and nor controllable. Europe must therefore avoid assuming desirable scenarios and instead ask itself under what conditions a change in power could lead to greater order, predictability and stability, and also under what conditions it could not. So that's what I will be watching closely, and where you can come to this channel, and where you can come back to this channel for context and analysis as events develop. And if you found this useful, consider subscribing. And if you'd like to support the work, you'll find links in the description. And if you are interested in why Trump's Venezuela operation matters more than you think, click right here. See you there.